Hello, everyone. Thank you in advance for checking out my presentation. I'm going to be presenting on the topic of cold exposure as a modality for recovery. So, just a little bit of background of why I chose this topic. It's something that's super interesting to me. I know as a college athlete, I was a softball pitcher. My coaches and trainers and teammates were always, harping on making sure we're icing our shoulders and taking care of ourselves throughout the season and as we're training in the off season, even through high school. And, my athletic background, I think it's something that has really been pushed through the sports world of, cold exposure, icing for recovery. I think in recent years, it's become more of a trend throughout, not just the sports world, but also just fitness in general. I know recently it's been used more as a mental challenge and it's been presented to show other benefits health wise. So we'll see. Throughout my research here, I've definitely presented some articles that are a little contradictory to that claim that it could be beneficial. We see things on both sides here. So I'm really excited to hear everyone's feedback. Obviously, for the purposes of this presentation, we'll be focused primarily on cold exposure as a modality for recovery specifically. Not so much the mental side of, the mental challenge of breath work and things like that, but just wanted to give a little background and I'm excited to hear what everybody thinks and read feedback. I will say after researching, the jury is still out on cold exposure. There's a lot of evidence kind of on both sides. It's beneficial or it's not. So on that note, let's get into it. So here's my questions to consider for my discussion post. Just kind of some things to think about throughout the presentation. I won't read through them all for you, but those are kind of what I'm hoping that we can kind of dive into together and see where we fall in terms of cold exposure. So the first article I got into, the purpose of this was to examine the effects of cold water immersion on perceived muscle soreness. In this study, methods wise, they use power output recovery and muscle damage. So these are jiu-jitsu athletes. They're all in their 20s. This study utilized eight highly trained male athletes. They range from 21 to 28 years old, so pretty young athletes, very well trained. They were randomly selected into half a sample. Half of them did cold exposure, half of them just used passive recovery. So the cold exposure that they used, just for a little bit of metrics, was about 6 degrees Celsius, and each athlete who was in the group for cold exposure did so after their competition or practice, and they stayed in the cold bath for 19 minutes. So pretty cold, pretty long time. After a week, the participants switched. So everyone who participated in this study got to do both passive recovery and cold exposure to kind of really compare the results. I like that they did that. When they examined everything, they examined the serum levels of the creatine phosphokinase. So they really looked at perceived muscle soreness, recovery. To analyze the recovery, they use visual analog scales, so kind of self-reporting in that regard. They also examined the muscle power of the arms and legs. So for the legs, they used a counter movement jump. And then for arms, they used the max pull-up hold. So, or chin-up hold, I should say. Kind of that supinated hands facing in. They examined these metrics pre-training. And then post-recovery, they examined 24 hours. And then again at 48 hours. So it's kind of interesting there. They concluded, the authors of this study concluded that cold exposure, kind of that water immersion, so they got in a full ice bath, was shown to decrease perceived muscle soreness and damage. And then it can definitely be beneficial when used as a recovery modality for these jiu-jitsu athletes. They are very highly trained. They train pretty frequently. So I included a couple graphics here. I thought these were super interesting, kind of the difference between the perceived pain scale. So you can see, this solid line on the left here is showing the perceived pain, or I'm sorry, the dotted line is showing the control group, and then the solid line is showing the cryotherapy group. So between the two, kind of their perceived pain after 24 hours post-recovery, and then they started out pre-training. So as their pain, their recovery, and it looks like both definitely decreased in their perceived pain. However, it looks like the cryotherapy dropped down a little quicker. They both seem to end up in the same spot after 48 hours. So I thought that was interesting. In the same regard with the perceived recovery group, they're on the right side of the presentation page. This one I thought was a little bit crazy. So they ended up in the same place after 48 hours, but it looks like recovery-wise, the control group seemed to kind of flatten out, whereas the cryotherapy group really dropped right post-recovery, and then after 24 hours, they reported a little more recovery. So I thought that was interesting to add. I wanted to kind of show the graphic that the authors included in showing kind of the metrics that they were examining. So in terms of this, they did conclude that cold immersion therapy can be beneficial when it comes to these jiu-jitsu athletes. Moving on here, the second article. So this was a trial of contrast baths and ice baths for recovery, and this was a U20 rugby union. So they wanted to examine the efficacy of a contrast bath as well as an ice bath on the muscle recovery after competition and practice. So they utilized ice baths as well as contrast baths. I thought that was interesting. So contrast baths going between heat and cold. Surprisingly, the ice bath group did report feeling less recovered than those who participated in either the contrast baths or no recovery modality. So those who were just, experiencing and participating in passive recovery still reported feeling more recovered than those who participated in the ice bath. So definitely in terms of this study, the ice bath was last on the list of the three groups in terms of recovery. I also included just some pre and post test scores here, so you can see when they concluded there really was no significant difference in the scores across the different treatments, but kind of in the discussion in that article, they really went into detail about the self-reporting aspect of the fact that the contrast and passive recovery groups reported higher recovery than those of the ice bath group. So on the mental side, just that self-reporting, even though in our post-test scores we can see that nothing was too significantly different enough to make an assumption from that, but in terms of self-reporting, it does look like the ice baths were last on the list. So thought that was interesting to add. And then post-exercise ice water immersion. So we're kind of talking about the same thing. This is taking it from the perspective of, is it a form of active recovery? So the purpose of this journal was to expand on the research regarding the efficacy of post-exercise ice water immersion as a recovery modality. And they really examined that even though, there is evidence to support ice water immersion, further research is required to say yes or no, this is a good form of active recovery. They also added in their conclusion that there are other modalities that will work better. So it's a better approach to kind of take a holistic approach to recovery in terms of stretching, nutrition. Really, when you think of the whole picture of an athlete's wellness, even though, they might see some benefit from cold water immersion, it's not going to be as significant as that whole picture of recovery. So one thing that I thought was super interesting about this article is that it really took two athletes one was a 23-year-old martial arts athlete, one was a 25-year-old marathon runner, and they both, after a significant amount of time, we're talking months, I think, the 23-year-old had been participating in ice water immersion for upwards of 6 months when this happened, and same with the 25-year-old marathon runner. They had both really added ice water immersion to their recovery routine. Both of them presented in the emergency room with late onset muscle soreness. So the martial arts athlete presented with bilateral arm pain. The 25-year-old marathon runner presented with lower limb pain. And what was interesting about this is that neither of them had any significant medical history. Both of them trained regularly. They were healthy, young male athletes. in different sports, but both very demanding sports. So I thought it was interesting that post ice water immersion, even though they had been doing it for months, they both presented in the hospital with this late onset muscle soreness. So it really is, when they concluded that there is a more holistic approach, further research is required to determine the efficacy of this recovery modality. And it really is, there's not enough evidence to support whether, did they have that late muscle onset soreness because of their ice water immersion, or was it something different in their training routine? Both did report that that was the newest thing that they had added to their recovery routine. So something to think about there. That's definitely interesting. So let's move on here. So I liked this article. It went into detail about cold exposure training paired with breathing exercises. So I know this is something that's really becoming more popular in the fitness industry, of kind of the mental aspect, the mental toughness of getting into an ice bath and being able to control your breath for an extended amount of time. So whether it's an ice bath or a cold shower, that's definitely something that is talked about more. It's becoming more popularized. So I thought this was a good one to add in to kind of see what effects does that have on your health. So the purpose of this was just to examine the efficacy of a combined cold exposure and breathing exercise routine on the voluntary activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And they concluded that it did activate the sympathetic nervous system. The study participants were healthy young males, and this study was definitely more clinical. I omitted some of the graphics in this study because they were so detailed with a lot of clinical jargon that I didn't think was super relevant for this presentation. But I would recommend, if you are going through this presentation and want to learn a little bit more about this, there's some really good graphics within this article that are interesting in terms of kind of the more clinical side of things and how that sympathetic nervous system activation can affect the rest of your health status. But for these purposes, really the breathing exercise, I know, I've touched on a couple times throughout the presentation, kind of the more popularized way that people are implementing cold water immersion and cold exposure in their training. So for athletes and, people who are just fitness enthusiasts, people who work out regularly, who want to activate their sympathetic nervous system, want to have the mental challenge of that cold exposure. While there is research to support that it does do those things. It's not necessarily, based on this study, the best modality for recovery. So it does have benefits to other parts of your health, but not necessarily recovery. So I thought that was interesting to add in as well. I think, I can't wait to hear what everybody else thinks. Based on these articles that I presented, I think there really is kind of a push and pull when it comes to cold water immersion, cold exposure, how it's implemented. And I think something that I thought was interesting that I didn't see a lot in my research was, I know I mentioned it in the first study I talked about, was the temperature and duration at which athletes and fitness individuals, people who work out, people who are, dabbling in this cold water exposure, have added it to their recovery routine. How long are they exposing themselves, and at what temperature are they exposing themselves? What is the method there, the modality? I think that could have a large play in terms of, the minute details of how this can affect our overall recovery and overall health status. So I would love to hear more about that if anybody has thoughts. But regardless, thank you so much for listening to my presentation about cold water exposure as a modality for recovery. I'm really excited to kind of interact with the posts and see, different sources that other people come up with, and see kind of where we can land on this, or even if there is anywhere to land right now. I know the jury is out, like I said. So thank you all so much, and I'm excited to interact in the discussion.